engaging the glide bombs isn't really an option. The only way to stop them is to engage the glide bomb launching aircraft, and Gripen and Meteor is the only way to do that for the Ukrainians. The longest range versions that the Ukrainians have access to are going to struggle to have a decent chance of shooting down a Russian fighter that comes relatively close to the lines, because that Russian fighter will be at high altitudes and speeds and will generally turn away when it's fired on. The Meteor is the only weapon that Ukraine has potential to access, which has a chance of starting to shoot down some of those glide bomb launching aircraft. Both Russia and Ukraine have been able to deny one another the ability to effectively operate fixed-wing aircraft and rotary-wing helicopters across the front lines for pretty much the entire war. Ukraine actually started this war with one of the largest air defense, ground-based air defense networks in Europe, certainly. So lots of what are called S-300 systems, so long-range, late Cold War era Soviet air defense systems, which the Ukrainians themselves had upgraded over the years. So they had quite a lot of those. They also had a fair few medium-range, what we would call in NATO SA-11 book, medium-range surface-to-air missile systems, and then a whole bunch of short-range systems like SA-8, which we would call OSA. And most importantly of all, perhaps, the Ukrainians had between 4 and 6 months worth of stockpiled ammunition for high-intensity conflict, which is in stark contrast to most NATO nations who maintain, particularly pre-Russian invasion of Ukraine, maintained very, very small war stocks of air defense missiles. So for the Russians, it really wasn't an easy target, if you like, to establish air superiority over Ukraine. There was still an expectation that they would be able to operate semi-regularly across the lines, but that they would face pop-up threats consistently. What occurred then was, to most Western analysts' surprise, including myself, was that we discovered that the Russians, even though they had quite a lot of kit, which, if they were operated according to Western tactics and the way that Western air forces work, should have been able to establish air superiority, at least over the frontline areas quite quickly, even with those Ukrainian air defenses in place. The Russians were able to fly quite a lot of stuff, but they weren't able to stitch the different elements of the different air capabilities that they had together, so that they operate in what in the West we call a CAMEO, which is a composite air operation, where you have lots of different elements of different types of aircraft with different weapons doing different jobs, all as part of a big plan that comes together as kind of a pulse, which you do several times a day, as you would see in a Western air campaign. And the Russians just couldn't do it. So they had quite a lot of capability, but no ability to really sequence it together. What that led to then is, over the sort of subsequent few years, is this development where both sides have used the aircraft they have to basically lob weapons of various kinds from standoff ranges. So they'll generally approach the front lines from the Ukrainian case at very low altitude, because Russia has a much more capable air defense system than Ukraine near the front lines and lots of fighters. So they approach the Ukrainians very low, and then they pull up when they're getting to within several tens of kilometers of the front, and release glide bombs which are kind of lobbed and can reach several tens of kilometers into Russian lines against fixed targets. The Russians do the same thing, but at a much greater scale. So they lob hundreds and hundreds of glide bombs a week. And because Ukraine's air defense system, its Soviet one, ran out of ammunition within a year or so, and that now they use mostly Western-supplied ground-based air defense systems like Patriot or NASAMS, but with much less ammunition and far fewer systems, they can't put a dense air defense network near the front lines themselves. The Russians still can't cross the lines. If they come too close, they periodically get shot down by a Patriot missile usually, or in one case an F-16 recently. But they're able to lob hundreds and hundreds of glide bombs from high altitudes and distances, so about 60, 70 kilometers from behind their own lines. They launch lots of these heavy bombs. So that's kind of the main way that air power is being used by both sides. And of course, both sides are also doing a separate long-range strike campaign. With Ukraine's current fighter force, they have most of their fighter capability now is F-16, so a Western multi-role American-made jet supplied by the Netherlands, by Denmark, by Norway, and soon to be Belgium as well. So these are surplus multi-role fighters, mostly built in the 90s. They are capable multi-role jets. F-16 is a wonderful jet, but they're not designed to operate unsupported as the kind of leading edge against Russian S-400, SA-27, Buk M3, lots of fighters, etc. Like it's not what they're built for. For that, Western forces would use something like an F-35 and F-35s with lots of other supporting assets. And so what they're able to do, the Ukrainians, is periodically get in to launch a few glide bombs near the front lines. And they have once succeeded in shooting down a Russian fighter that, if you like, took the bait and came close to try and engage them, close to the lines, and then messed it up. So fantastic result. But the longest ranged air-to-air weapon that the F-16 can carry, which is the longest range air-to-air weapon that any Ukrainian fighter can currently carry, is the AMRAAM, so the Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, AIM-120. There are different variants of it, but suffice it to say, the longest range versions that the Ukrainians have access to are going to struggle to have a decent chance of shooting down even a Russian fighter that comes relatively close to the lines, because that Russian fighter will be at high altitudes and speeds and will generally turn away when it's fired on. And so if it turns away, that missile has to kind of go uphill and try and catch it. The reason Swedish Gripens are potentially a really significant improvement in terms of Ukraine's air capabilities when they arrive towards the beginning of next year, the Gripen CD initially, so that the current version, not the new Gripen E, which will be coming later. But the CD Gripens have a missile called Meteor, which is a European missile. The UK uses it as well on our Typhoons. It has a much longer effective range against an aware fighter type target than AMRAAM. And Meteor can't be carried by F-16. I mean, theoretically, it could be fitted, but it wouldn't work with the radar and the data links, and it's not compatible. The Gripen is the only thing that Ukraine has a reasonable chance of operating relatively soon that has access to that Meteor missile. And because the Meteor has what's called a ramjet, so it has a smaller rocket motor when it starts, so it starts off going less quickly than an AMRAAM, but then it ignites these supersonic, much more efficient liquid-fueled engines, ramjet engines, so it has power throughout the entire engagement rather than just the initial rocket boost. So when it arrives against a long-range target, it still has a lot of energy, and it can potentially chase down and catch a maneuvering target at much longer ranges than an AMRAAM could. So for the task of going after those glide bomb launching Sukhoi 34s generally, so Russian Sukhoi 34 fullbacks, which are fighter bombers if you like, the Meteor is the only weapon that Ukraine has potential to access quite soon, which, coupled with the right tactics, clever enablement, clever mission planning, it'd still be difficult, but has a chance of starting to shoot down some of those glide bomb launching aircraft. You can't engage the glide bombs directly because, firstly, there are far too many of them. So Russia's using between 400 and sometimes up to 850 a week. So the number of missiles you would need to try and shoot those down is just completely impractical for Western industry to supply, let alone for Ukraine to use today. But also, you would have to put those surface-to-air missile systems to try and engage the glide bombs quite close to the front lines, where they would be vulnerable to Russian loitering munitions, so drone-type things, and artillery. And Ukraine needs its surface-to-air missile systems to protect its cities and its infrastructure and its bases and other things against things like cruise missiles. So engaging the glide bombs isn't really an option. The only way to stop them is to engage the glide bomb launching aircraft, and Gripen and Meteor is the only way to do that for the Ukrainians. So in the absence of being able to establish localized air superiority and have a decisive potential impact on the frontline areas with traditional tactical air power, both rotary and sort of fighters, the Ukrainians and the Russians, but particularly the Russians, have fallen back on a reliance on long-range strike campaigns. So the Russians have been doing this since the start of the war. They mix ballistic missiles increasingly, which are essentially large rockets with a roughly 1-ton warhead that are fired and come in at very, very high speeds from very high altitudes, so a ballistic trajectory, hence ballistic missile. Those are pretty expensive, but they are very hard to intercept. Traditional medium-range or short-range surface-to-air missile systems or other short-range air defenses can't engage them. They're too fast. So there are only a few things that can. The most successful by far being Patriot, which is why you hear so much about the Patriot system and Ukraine's desperate need for more Patriot missiles to intercept those Russian ballistic missiles, alongside usually several tens of those. In a salvo, the Russians will fire several times that number, usually 2 or 3 times as many cruise missiles, which are a bit like a little jet aircraft. So they carry between a half-ton and a ton warhead, about Mach 0.8 or 0.9, so about 500, 600 miles an hour, typical cruise speeds. So they're very hard to intercept with traditional short-range air defenses unless they're at the point where the missile is coming in. But medium-range air defenses, so NASAMS, for example, or IRIS-T, can absolutely engage them as they go past. And occasionally you get lucky with point defenses. F-16 has been very efficient at intercepting those cruise missiles because they fly much like an aircraft, albeit at quite low level. They're very, very accurate and they're very, very damaging. So they're a primary target for Ukrainian air defenses to try and engage. And then particularly since early 2024, the Russians have been essentially leveling in huge numbers of one-way attack drones, which are essentially cheap propeller, or more recently, some of them are jet-powered, miniature cruise missiles. The Iranian-made Shahed 136, which has then been produced under license and then iterated upon by the Russians as the Gripen 2. So it goes about 130 miles an hour, has essentially a moped engine, and carries up to about a 90-kilogram warhead. So they're not nearly as destructive as cruise missiles, but there are lots more of them. They're much cheaper. Typically, they're about $70,000, depending on the variant. Some of them are more expensive if they have camera modules and network rebroadcasters and things to enable them to be controlled over a distance, or jammers. But the base model's around $70,000 as opposed to about one point something million dollars for a cruise missile. So you see up to 450, sometimes even more occasionally, of these drones plus decoys called Gaberas, which saturate Ukrainian air defense capacity. And so they present lots and lots of individually much less threatening targets, but that are still a risk to civilians particularly, and they're disruptive. So that's where Ukraine has been developing lots of short-range air defense systems to try and engage those cheaply and efficiently, given they have lots of people. It's a mobilized country. They can deploy lots of short-range air defenses, anti-aircraft guns, shoulder-fired manpads, and drone interceptors to try and whittle down those waves of the one-way drones and allow the higher-end systems like F-16, NASAMS, IRIS-T to concentrate on the cruise missiles, and Patriot and SAMP-T, if there is some, to concentrate on ballistics. The Ukrainians don't have access to anything like that in terms of that mix or that weight, but they have been, particularly over the last year and a half, waging an increasingly successful long-range strike campaign of their own using one-way drones, similar to the Gripen in some ways. There's a bigger variety of them. And they're targeting primarily Russia's oil and gas infrastructure to try and cause economic and visible damage. So show the Russian population that the war isn't just something that happens in Ukraine, it's something that will come to them, given Russia started the war with no prompting. So trying to puncture that Russian leadership narrative to their people that the war is a special military operation. It's not a war. It's something that happens over there in Ukraine. Don't worry about it. And they've been very successful recently with causing huge fires at refineries, for example, around Moscow, St. Petersburg, a number of other Russian cities, which has caused significant political damage for the Russian leadership. And they're also increasingly targeting Wildberries warehouses, which is essentially the Russian equivalent of Amazon, to try and, again, bring that disruption to Russian everyday life to try and increase the political costs of continuing the war for the Russian regime. Remembering that for both Ukraine and Russia, these are two economies and two societies that are very tired of this war. Russia is obviously bigger and has more resilience than Ukraine, and certainly more personnel to draw on. But the difference being that for Ukraine, this is a war of survival. They know what happens in the occupied areas. They have no desire to see that spread across the country. The mass looting, the rape, the torture. It's genuinely appalling what happens in the conquered areas. So the Ukrainians are, very tired, but they are absolutely still committed to fighting to protect the rest of their remaining country. For the Russians, this is the Russian leadership's kind of pet project. So it's fundamentally a discretionary war. The Russians can end the war whenever they want. If they stop fighting, the war ends. And so while both countries are very tired, the current situation where there is essentially a stalemate again, the Ukrainians have turned around the momentum which had been going against them through much of 2024 and all of 2025. All of 2026 so far, the Ukrainians have turned around that momentum. The Russians aren't really gaining any ground. They're gaining ground in a few areas, but it's matched at least generally by ground where the Ukrainians are taking back territory. Russian casualties have skyrocketed. And so, interestingly, there's kind of a battlefield stalemate. So that long-range strike duel is now about trying to impose cost on the population and therefore impose pressure on the leadership to come to some sort of serious negotiations. A key question for the coming weeks is whether the US administration facilitates resupply of Patriot interceptor missiles to Ukraine or not. This wouldn't be a gift. These would be missiles that have already been paid for by European countries through what's called the PURL mechanism, which is a mechanism that's been set up for European countries to finance purchases of American weapon systems for Ukraine, because America, since the second Trump administration took office, has not supplied anything as aid. It's just European countries buying stuff from American companies that is then supplied. But there is a global shortage of Patriot ammunition, which has been made vastly worse by enormous expenditure of Patriot PAC-3 missiles by both the US itself and by the Gulf states in Operation Epic Fury, which is the US and Israeli attack on Iran since beginning of February. They've expended many times more missiles than Ukraine has been gifted through the last 4.5 years of conflict. And so now there is a global shortage of Patriot missiles. There already weren't enough to meet the demand of how many countries wanted to buy them to beef up and start building stocks or to acquire the system new, because it's very effective and there's a lot of ballistic missile threat technology out there in a lot of parts of the world, particularly from China. So lots of demand for Patriot. Therefore, the US lever that it has to play with as an administration is not whether it gifts or not. That's not going to happen. It's whether it allocates priority among a long list of countries that have ordered Patriot missiles, and the US military, which has ordered lots of Patriot missiles, from a global production which is far too small to meet the total demand each year. The US administration essentially has the levers to decide who gets priority in that list. So one critical question is going to be whether they allocate at least part of that production rate as a priority thing towards European orders that are for Ukraine, or whether they don't. Because ultimately, European countries have given most of what they have to give in terms of their own Patriot stocks, those countries that have them, like Germany. And therefore, they're waiting for resupply, not just for themselves, but also to send to Ukraine. So it's not a question of just asking European countries to dig deeper. They've kind of already given what they can, and in many cases, what they have. So, that's one of the key questions. There's ultimately not many other options for mitigating the increasingly heavy ballistic missile strikes on Ukrainian cities, particularly Kyiv, but also bases and other infrastructure, because there's only one other anti-ballistic system that Ukraine operates. It's SAMP-T, it's Franco-Italian. That system is not as effective as Patriot PAC-3 against the latest Russian ballistic missiles. And it's also produced in very small quantities relative to PAC-3. So it's not a solution. Ukraine is working on its own version, its own anti-ballistic interceptor called Freya, based on a domestically developed ballistic missile. But that will take a long time to be effective. If it becomes effective, it's a very, very hard technological thing to do. So the Russians know this because Zelensky has had to publicly state repeatedly in multiple places that Ukraine doesn't have any Patriots left at multiple points. So it's not a secret. The Russians know. And so they are putting more and more resource into increasing their production of ballistic missiles at the expense of, for example, cruise missiles, so they can take advantage of that Ukrainian lack of protection that's been in place pretty much since late 2022. So yeah, a critical test for the next few months is whether the US administration prioritizes resupply of Patriot interceptors to Ukraine or not. Of the global production, you certainly wouldn't need to allocate anything like all of it to Ukraine to make a big difference, but you would need to allocate a fair bit of it.